So, here we go again. Let me begin by welcoming you back to Comparative Religion and to this, my second YouTube lecture. Okay, I know, it actually says YouTube lecture number 1. When I was setting things up, it seemed to me that it would be in your interest and mine to keep my audio lectures and PowerPoint presentations here on YouTube coordinated, numerically with the written lectures that you're reading in my Paths of Return. So today, obviously, this lecture corresponds to Lecture 1, Religion, Science, Faith, and Knowledge in the reader, in the Paths of Return. But then I thought, there really ought to be some sort of overview, introductory lecture, and that's what you listened to last time. So I guess you're going to have to call that lecture YouTube Lecture 0 in order to end up on the right page. But we know what we're doing here. I think we all know what we're doing. I do hope you're keeping track of the to-do list and that you're taking things in the order presented there. So I hope you have already read, before you're listening to this, the article by C.S. Lewis in A Book of Saints called Meditation in a Toolshed. And then I do hope that you've already read the written lecture number 1 in Paths of Return. All of what I say here today will make a lot better sense if you have that background in mind. And then let me add too, I hope after listening to this now today, you go ahead and take quiz number 1. That's the next item in the to-do list. It's going to be a lot easier for you to manage the quizzes if, with the material fresh in your mind, you go ahead and take the quiz. So keep that in mind as well. Today, I'm going to let you in on a secret. It's one of those secrets that's actually right there in plain view, but few people, or perhaps I should say at least few academics, people like me, seem to see it. It has to do with a fundamental inconsistency. Knowing the secret of that inconsistency is going to make you instantly smarter than dozens, nay rather hundreds of people with PhDs. So that's my catch, my invitation to keep your attention glued here today. A big secret is going to be coming up in a few minutes. All right, so religion, science, faith, and knowledge. As I said in the lecture you read in Paths of Return, we've defined the word religion. Actually, we've defined the word religion in the singular and the word religions in the plural. And in order to follow what we're doing today now, as we compare what religion and science can tell us, what the relationship is between faith and knowledge, we need now to define the word science. This is very important. The big question, of course, that we're wrestling with is what you see here on the screen. Is there more to reality than the merely material? Religions say yes. Modern contemporary scientists tend to say no. If so, if there is more to reality, can we know it? The religions say yes. Modern science says no. So what's going on here? We're going to try to understand this big conflict if we can. But let's try to define the word science. Pulled up here some definitions that you can find in a dictionary. 1, study of the physical world and its manifestations, especially by using systematic observation and experiment. 2, knowledge gained by this study, by the study of the physical world. But then notice number 3, science is any systematically organized body of knowledge about a specific subject. That's a more open definition, isn't it? And it reflects the etymology of the word science, which I mentioned in the lecture you read. The word science comes from the Latin verb scire, the infinitive form of the verb scire, which means to know. Hence, science is really knowledge of anything. Anything that you can know has a science attached to it. So we're familiar, obviously, with sciences like biology and geology, which study physical realities, living organisms and rocks and the earth. But there could well be a science that studied non-physical realities, theology being the science of God, angelology being the science, the study, the knowledge of angels and how many there are and what they do and so forth. So it's the knowledge of anything. But you and I both know very well that in the world that we live in, modern science, contemporary science, whatever you want to call it here now, has restricted what you can know quite severely. Modern science would say that it consists in various methods and means of knowing the material world, the physical world, by an exclusively empirical or sensory means. I defined that word empirical in the lecture you read. Anything empirical is something you can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell. In other words, something you can come into relationship with one of your 5 natural senses. To be a modern scientist, therefore, like this look-alike of, I guess, Albert Einstein with the test tube, is to assume, at least while you're on the job, that the only way to know anything truly is by using your physical senses. And therefore, the only thing you can really know is matter, or energy, but energy only insofar as it has material effects. Even supposing, notice this last line on the slide, even supposing something else might exist, you can't know it. Or you can't at least know it if you are a modern scientist. If you define the word science or define the understanding of knowledge in modern science as exclusively empirical and physical. But this is obviously in stark, radical contrast with the unanimous teaching of all the world's major religious traditions, all of which would say that the material world, the world of computers, kumquats, and koala bears, is only one level of a much vaster reality. A reality that you can come to know by activating the corresponding level within yourself. Now that's kind of esoteric language, I guess, isn't it? But it's not really so difficult to understand if we break it down into parts. We have in us capacities for knowledge. I'm going to make this kind of simple right now as a metaphor at least. Your nose has a capacity for odors, and your fingers have a capacity for texture, smooth, rough, whatever. And your eyes, right, have a capacity for light and for color. You can't see with your nose, and you can't smell with your eyes, and you can't hear with your fingers. You have to use the right organ of knowledge. You have to use the right level, as it were, in yourself in order to know the corresponding level of things around you, the smells, the sights, the colors, and so forth. Well, we're going to expand upon that, but that's the basic point here. You have to use the right organ of knowledge in order to access the level of reality that you're seeking to know about. But the deal, again, is modern science tends to constrict things. The religions want to open things up and say what we see around us right now in the physical world through our seeing and hearing and tasting and touching and smelling is just one level. Somebody has used this image. It's as though there's this huge picture window. And outside of the picture window, as you look out through the window, you see in the distance this vast, beautiful, snow-capped mountain. And maybe down in the foreground, a beautiful shimmering lake or, something like that. But what's happened is that somebody's come into the room and pulled the shade down over this window, down, until it's almost right at the bottom with just a sliver of window exposed, through which all you can see is the dirt or maybe the grass, right outside of the building, just outside of the window. You can't see anything else. Well, the religions, basically looking at science, would say, you've pulled down the shade, guys. You're not seeing what's there because you're only looking at a tiny slice of reality. Here's an image that might be of use here as well. So this is trying to basically communicate again the idea that there are levels within us that correspond to multiple levels in external reality. So notice this figure has a body and a mind and a soul and a spirit. And if you look at things in terms of these concentric circles, you can see that the body, which contains our 5 natural senses, obviously corresponds to the terrestrial level. I'm calling it the physical, the material level, but it's the same basic idea. In terms of the self, the body corresponds to the terrestrial in terms of reality. The mind corresponds in this diagram to what this person has called the intermediate, the soul to the celestial, and the spirit to the infinite. Now, what these terms may mean and all the nuances, etc., let's not worry about for the moment. But again, the idea here is that we have within us capacities that we need to engage or to activate if, with the religions, we seek to know something beyond the physical plane of reality. This much more complex diagram comes from one of my friend Houston Smith's books. I mentioned him last time. I'm not going to even begin to try to pull this apart. You can freeze frame this if you'd like for yourselves, pause the YouTube and kind of study these terms. But the point of the diagram is simply to say each of the major religions, and you can see them there, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, Islam, and so forth, has terms for the levels of the self, the deeper levels of the self that's inside of all of us, and then the external, the outer, the levels of reality. And again, there's a correspondence between the inner and outer for all the religions. Take a look at that, study that maybe more carefully later. The problem for us that I mentioned already in the lecture you read is that religious studies itself as a discipline, an academic discipline in the modern university, has been deeply affected, I would say infected, by the assumptions, procedures, and expectations of the modern scientific method, which means that religious studies professors, academics like me, often approach their subject, the religions of the world, with the assumptions of modern science in mind, and assuming that all they can say about the religions must measure up to what modern science permits us to say. Take a look at the quotation here on this slide. A fellow named John Barber, he teaches at St. Olaf College, I think, has written, "In public and private institutions alike, practitioners of religious studies have been anxious to prove they can be as tough-minded and academically rigorous as their colleagues in other disciplines." This man Barber goes on to explain what he means by tough-minded and rigorous, and basically what it means is you have to have data, you have to have something you can graph, you have to have something you can count in a kind of scientifically, respectable way. Hence, the only things that you can actually know and talk about with authority or certainty or objectivity and so forth as a practitioner of religious studies are things that, compare favorably to the kind of things that scientists talk about. You might want to go on my website and click on my weblog anamnesis. I got a response to this particular comment, this article by this man Barber. You can see already I don't really agree with this, but that's what's out there, and I wanted you to understand that many religious studies professors do look at things that way. Here's where I want to draw on the article by C.S. Lewis, Meditation in a Tool Shed. Let me just read the first couple of paragraphs here to remind you of what Lewis has said. "I was standing today in the dark tool shed," and I've got a picture here that maybe is a kind of dark tool shed. "The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light with the specks of dust floating in it was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. And then I moved, so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no tool shed, and above all, no beam. Instead I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside. And beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences." And of course now he goes on to make use of that distinction, to look along and look at, and applies it to love and applies it to mathematics I want to apply it to religious studies. Let's try to see what it would mean both to look at and then to look along the religions that we're going to be studying. First of all, looking at. I talk about the looking at scholars in my Paths of Return lecture, as you know. And I distinguish three types or three categories: the primitivists, the functionalists, and then a group I call fideists, basing that on the Latin word for faith, which is fides. So fideists, I guess you could also call faithists if you'd like to do that. Primitivism, first of all, the looking at type of religious scholarship that I'm calling here primitivism, is well exemplified by a man I mentioned last time, Richard Dawkins, and especially in his book, The God Delusion. Here's what this man Dawkins says. Well, first of all, here's what he says on his website about what he has said in that book. Quote, "With rigor and wit, Richard Dawkins," that's himself, "eviscerates the major arguments for religion, cuts them to pieces, pulls their bowels out, literally, that's what it means to eviscerate, and shows how religion fuels war, foments bigotry, and abuses children, buttressing his points with historical and contemporary evidence. The God Delusion makes a compelling case that belief in God is not just wrong, but potentially deadly." And then quoting from the first chapter of The God Delusion, "There is nothing beyond the natural physical world, no supernatural creative intelligence lurking behind the observable universe, no soul that outlasts the body, no miracles, except in the sense of natural phenomena that we don't yet understand." Okay, so Dawkins, a good exemplification of a primitivist understanding of religion. What is religion? It's just basically stupid. It doesn't make any sense. There's nothing out there, ladies and gentlemen, except the natural and the physical world. In the reading in Paths of Return, of course, I used both Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud as examples of the primitivist approach as well. And then there's functionalism. Here I want to use as my exemplary person for a functionalist understanding of religion, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, as I recall. Here's what she has to say. Let's see how this fits into what I'm talking about. "In order to effectively conduct foreign policy today, you have to understand the role of God in religion. Religion is instrumental in shaping ideas and policies. It's an essential part of everyday life in a whole host of countries. And obviously, it plays a role in how these countries behave. So we need to know what religious influence is. I'm not a theologian. I've not turned into a religious mystic, but I'm a practical problem solver. So I'm looking at religion. Notice, looking at religion from the perspective of how knowledge about what people believe in can be useful in terms of trying to resolve the most serious disputes. She thinks it behooves our diplomats to be very knowledgeable about religion when they're sent to a country. They obviously learn the language and the history and culture. They need to learn about the religion too." Okay, remember, the functionalist is the person who says, religion plays a very important role in people's lives. It can have a negative impact, but it can also have positive impact insofar as it helps to develop social cohesion and group identity and promotes virtue and honesty and good conduct, those sorts of things. But again, the whole point here for the functionalist, it's not what the religions themselves say about God or angels or life after death or the creation of the world that we're really interested in. We're just interested in how people's beliefs function, the role that they play in people's social relationships, so that we can better understand, in this case, what to do perhaps in negotiating or being diplomatic with one of the countries in the Middle East that's Muslim in character. We need to understand how religion impacts all of that. Okay? That's the second kind of looking at type of approach to religion. And then thirdly, the fideists. Here I've quoted from the department website of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina. at least as it was dated back in 2010. I haven't looked, frankly, recently. I doubt they have changed their statement. Here's what they say. The goal of religious studies should not be to demonstrate or refute provocative religious concepts. Well, what are provocative religious concepts? Well, they're things like the existence of God, the idea of reincarnation, the possibility of burning in hell. By nature, such issues are supernatural and or metaphysical. So supernatural beyond the natural order, metaphysical beyond the physical world. And now here's the key. And thus, because they're supernatural and metaphysical, they're not open to rational inquiry. You can't be reasonable about them. You can't use logic to talk about religion at all. A more appropriate approach in religious studies involves contextualizing such questions. You might examine a particular Buddhist's conception of reincarnation. You might look at Friedrich Nietzsche's, Nietzsche was an atheist, his questioning of the existence of God. You might look at a piece of medieval Catholic artwork that depicts eternal damnation. Neither faith nor received tradition, however, constitutes a valid basis for an argument in academic teaching and writing. Okay, if you've read, and I hope that you have, my lecture in Paths of Return, you can see how this fits so perfectly with my definition of fideism. The fideist is the person who says, well, there may well be a God. It's not a primitivist approach which debunks and rejects all of that as just delusion like Dawkins does. No, there might be a God. Maybe we do have a soul. Maybe we do live, in fact, after we die. Maybe we're reincarnated, as the Hindus and Buddhists might say. Maybe there's a hell, maybe there's a heaven. But none of those things, even if we believe them ourselves, are things that we can talk about rationally, are things that we can actually prove, demonstrate, use logic about. And therefore, none of that stuff should really be discussed in an academic environment, either in a professional paper or article or book that a professor might write, or in the university classroom. That's the perspective, that's the approach of apparently all the faculty in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina. Well, as I said in the lecture you read, I'm not really happy with any of these approaches, these looking at approaches, neither the primitivist, nor the functionalist, nor the fideist. I want to redirect our vision. I want to get at what I called in the reading the real meaning of religion. And I want to do that by, again, using this Lewis distinction between looking at, looking along. Quoting again from the essay of Lewis's, it's perfectly easy to go on all your life giving explanations of religion without having been inside any of them. So it's kind of like being in or outside of the sunbeam, right? You can go on explaining a thing without knowing what it is. That's why a great deal of contemporary thought is, strictly speaking, thought about nothing. All the apparatus of thought busily working in a vacuum. If Lewis is right, then whatever form the looking at explanations might take, and I'm reviewing them here just briefly again, it's whether it's the aggressive evisceration of primitivists like Dawkins, the patronizing condescension of functionalists, or the intellectual, I'm being very bold here now and pretty direct and challenging, the intellectual cowardice of the fideist, who's afraid to talk about faith in an academic environment. Whatever explanation you might look at, they're all no better, in my opinion, than the opinions of tone-deaf musicologists, people who can't hear but who talk about music, or blind art historians, people who can't see but who talk about paintings, or maybe professional wine tasters who have neither tongues nor noses. That's my approach, my belief, my conviction concerning these various looking at approaches to religious studies. But somebody might ask me, what's the alternative? If I want to be intellectually honest and academically respectable, don't I have to go along with the consensus of our times that science, modern science's ways of knowing things, the empirical method, is the only way we can really approach reality, is really the only way we can talk about things that can be known? Don't we have to do it that way? Well, I don't think so. I would say no, you don't. And Lewis himself gives one very important reason why you don't have to go along with the looking at scholars in defending what he calls the looking along approach. Here's what he says, quoting again from the article you've read. You can step outside one experience in order to look at it only by stepping inside another experience, where you then are looking along that experience. Therefore, we have to deny from the very outset the idea that looking at is by its own nature intrinsically truer or better than looking along. All of us, all the time, whether we're modern scientists or not, primitivists, functionalists, fideists, whatever, we're always looking along something, namely the current set of assumptions, which at least at that moment we don't question. We're not looking at those assumptions, we're accepting them, presupposing them as we think or we talk or we write or we teach or whatever. We're looking along those assumptions. We're always looking along something. So to say you have to look at something and that looking at is intrinsically truer or better is in a way self-contradictory. But there's another reason, another self-contradiction, very simple reason for doubting the doubters, and it seems to me a good reason for stepping into the sunbeam. And it has to do with what I call here the radical inconsistency of empiricism. And here's where we come to that secret that I mentioned a few minutes ago, a secret right under people's noses that they don't often admit or recognize or acknowledge. And I want you to understand, what is the inconsistency? Well, here it is. It's impossible to know whether the only way to know something is by using your physical senses. By using your physical senses. Do you see that? I'm not going to try to unpack that, I don't think. I want you to ponder. I want you to look at that. Maybe look along it, I should say. I want you to see what the contradiction, the inconsistency is. It's impossible to know whether. And then in blue we have, right, the paradigmatic conviction of modern science. The modern scientist says, quote, the only way to know something is by using your physical senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. But now my point is, you can't know that that's the only way to know by just using your seeing, your hearing, your tasting, your touching, your smelling. No, you've brought that assumption to the table. It's an unexamined assumption that the only way we can know things is by using our physical senses. Somebody has said that. Somebody has claimed that. And you've accepted that. But not by verifying it empirically. There'd be no way to verify that claim itself empirically. Well, think about that. Ponder that a little bit more in your spare time. Okay, finally, I mentioned toward the end of the lecture you read that I wanted to make a distinction, a kind of preliminary distinction between what I've called levels of religious participation. And I compared this in the reading, in the reader, to participation in a club, maybe a sports team, something like that. But let's now use it more directly with respect to the religions we're going to be studying this term. I would say, I want you to begin thinking about this, that there are 4, at least, levels of engagement or participation when it comes to religious conviction and practice and participation. Beginning at the bottom with belief, then going to faith, then going to experience, and then up, finally to number 4, what I call transformation. Let me try to explain these by some analogies. Belief. What do I mean by belief? Belief is simply mental acceptance of a claim, an idea, based on some authority. Somebody has told you this is the way things are, and you accept it with your mind. You say, okay, I'll believe that. You might compare that to what we do when we trust a map. Maybe we've never been to wherever, I don't know, Pittsburgh, and we're driving up there from South Carolina. And we haven't been down the road before. We don't know what the outskirts of Pittsburgh will look like. We just trust the map to tell us that we're going in the right direction. We believe the map. Or another analogy here would be belief is rather like hearing about fire. Never yet having seen fire, experienced fire. You just hear somebody talk about fire. They say, there's such a thing as fire. And you go, okay, I believe it. That's belief. That's the, how do I say, most superficial, most elementary engagement or participation a person can have in a religion simply to believe what it says on authority. Oh, and I have an image here too. I've got Smokey Bear telling you that you need to prevent forest fires right at the edge of a park, maybe a national park. And he's telling you that fire danger is pretty high today. And you've never seen fire, you don't know what fire is, but you accept the idea that fire exists because Smokey says so. All right, then faith, coming up to number 2 in levels of participation. What do I mean by faith? Well, let's define it this way. Faith is a thoroughgoing commitment to the truth of the idea or the claim which you accepted when you believed it, back at level number 1. But thoroughgoing commitment is bigger, isn't it? It's not just, okay, I believe it. No, you begin acting in accordance with what you believe if you have faith. Your life begins to be colored by, shaped by, in some way conditioned or determined by your convictions at the level of faith. And I could compare that again by analogy to following the map, journeying with someone who's actually been to the city, who's read the map as you've read the map, who's followed the map, who's gone there before you've even set out on your journey, and who now has come back and says, come along with me, I actually know the way. Okay, well that's more than just believing the map now. You've got a companion for the journey. Or the fire analogy. Now it's not just reading signs that Smokey sets up to tell you there's fire. It's actually seeing the smoke from the fire by analogy. That's what faith is. So to be sort of like this. You go into the state park, the national park, and yeah, you can see some smoke. So now you have a little bit more confirmation, don't you, that what you believed is the truth. Then we go to experience. What do I mean by experience? Well, I mean that you get some kind of direct contact, direct perception, I say here, with the reality behind the idea which you believed to begin with and then began committing yourself to. Now, notice experience is not just seeing and hearing and tasting and touching and smelling. It might include that. But I'm wanting to keep open the idea of experience to be more consistent with the religious traditions we'll study, which all would say it's possible to have non-empirical, supra-sensory experiences. Possible to know things that aren't physical, possible to know things that aren't just material. So keeping our minds open at least to that possibility, experience is a direct perception of realities like God himself behind the believing conviction and the faith and so forth that go with religious participation. You can compare that by analogy to arriving at the city that the map had told you about and that the person you were journeying with had said he'd been to himself. Well, you're there now. You get there. You arrive at the city. Or in terms of our forest fire, you begin feeling the heat of the fire, not just, seeing the smoke or seeing Smokey Bear's sign. You can actually begin sensing the heat itself from the fire. That's kind of like what I'm talking about when I talk about religious experience, going beyond religious faith and religious belief. And then finally, transformation, the highest, deepest, vastest level of participation of all. What do I mean by transformation? Well, I mean coming to share in the very reality behind the idea. So now I'm not just believing it, I'm not just having faith in it and conforming my life to it. I'm not just coming into contact with it, I'm actually beginning to participate in the reality itself and being changed thereby. Maybe like settling down in the city I get to. Maybe like being engulfed or inflamed by the fire. Notice my asterisk with transformation coming down to the bottom of the slide. Transformation corresponds to the sanctity and the sagacity of the real authorities to whom we shall look as we study these religions this term. Remember my distinction last time between democratic and aristocratic approaches. The aristocratic approach says if we really want to understand Hinduism, if we really want to understand Islam or Judaism or one of the religions of China like Confucianism, what we need to do is listen to what the people who've gone the full route tell us, the saints, the sages, the spiritual experts, the spiritual authorities. Well, those are people who now in my term here today have been transformed by the reality behind the ideas of their religions, who've gone beyond just belief, certainly, gone beyond faith, gone even beyond experience, and been totally transformed. Well, so here's my last image, my last slide. I'm not saying that the fireman here in this picture is necessarily a saint. He's got his fire gear on, I guess. He's inside of the flames. But it's a good image maybe for what I'm talking about when I speak of transformation. I want to share with you finally a quotation from the person whose name I give you here, Abba Joseph of Panephasis. And who's he? Abba Joseph of Panephasis was one of the early Christian, we call them desert fathers, ascetics, many of them hermits, who lived in the Egyptian and Syrian deserts in late 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries AD, and who lived a very, very, very intense kind of spiritual life. One of them, this Abba Joseph, a little story about him kind of rounds out what I want to say here about transformation. And I'll end with my quotation from this Abba Joseph today. Here's the anecdote. Here's the story about him. Another of the Desert Fathers, a guy named Abba Lot, went to see Abba Joseph and said to him, "Abba, as far as I can, I say my little office. I fast a little. I pray and I meditate. I live in peace. And as far as I can, I purify my thoughts. What else can I do?" Then the old man, Abba Joseph, stood up, stretched his hands towards heaven. His fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said to Abba Lot, "If you will, you can become all flame." That's what I mean by transformation. That's the highest level of participation. That's what these religions finally are all about.